can't slide, you can't drive. That's it. That's just the rule.
Bitch, I'm gassed up. Bitch, I'm gassed up. Bitch, I'm gassed up. Bitch, I'm gassed up.
Rum, 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 I'm an idiot. Rum, rum, rum.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Too Fast TV. It's your host, Miss JDM, and I'm pretty excited because today we're going to be talking about Boost. Are you ready for an increase in horsepower but aren't quite familiar with your options? Well, the answer is forced induction, and there are two ways to achieve it. Now, before we jump ahead, just remember that there are different kinds of turbos and superchargers available. But for this particular episode, we're going to be focusing on the main differences between the two systems. Let's start with the turbo. A turbocharger uses the exhaust gas to drive a turbine. This spins an air compressor that pushes extra air and oxygen into the cylinders, allowing them to burn more fuel each second. However, with the supercharger, instead of being driven by exhaust gases using a turbine, it's powered from the car's spinning crankshaft. The Roots supercharger works through a pair of rotors that blow air at a high speed into the intake port. As the port then contains a greater quantity of air, it becomes compressed. In turn, this enables a higher quantity of fuel to be injected into the combustion chamber and thus greater power to be generated. Okay, so now that you know how they both work, which will you decide to pick? Let's take a look at the pros and cons for both systems. Let's start with turbos. Not only do they significantly increase horsepower, but they also allow for engines with smaller displacements to produce much more power relative to their size. Lastly, turbochargers run off energy that is typically lost in naturally aspirated and supercharged engines. Thus, the recovery of this energy improves the overall efficiency of the engine. Let's take a look at the less appealing aspects of turbos. Turbo lag is probably the most common one, and in most cases, especially in larger turbos, it will take a lot of time to spool up, and because of that, the power you need at the time may not be available. Whereas with superchargers, you're getting instant power right away. The boost threshold is another issue. Turbochargers are often sized for certain RPM ranges and do not typically operate across as wide an RPM range as superchargers. And in some applications, especially with larger turbos, reaching the boost threshold can provide an almost instantaneous surge in power, which can compromise tire traction or cause some instability of the car. Turbochargers also get very hot and often tap into the engine's oil supply. This calls for additional plumbing and is more demanding on the engine oil. Superchargers, on the other hand, typically do not require engine oil lubrication.
Hey guys, I'm with Darren today with his R34. Thank you so much for coming. Quick question for you. Why did you decide to go with a single turbo rather than a twin?
So I had a single turbo on there originally. I was a four-border S364 SX. I liked the performance of it. It wasn't really laggy. I wanted to keep the current configuration. It keeps the engine bay nice and clean, less piping. So I ended up going to an S369 SXE. It should take me to 1,000 at the wheels, hopefully a little more. But ultimately, yeah, I wanted to just keep the engine bay looking clean and keep the piping as simplistic as possible. And honestly, the lag is really not at where I'd want to go back to a twin setup to kind of recover some of that turbo lag. So that's why I kept the single.
So I understand that you've actually had superchargers in the past. So in comparison to turbos, which would you prefer and why?
So I prefer turbos. I think it's just much better to use wasted gas to make power versus spending power to make power and having parasitic drag on the supercharger. Superchargers have their spot for sure. I have a built 99 Mustang. Had a Eaton Celine supercharger, root style supercharger on it. The power down low is amazing. It starts to get pretty inefficient around 8-9 pounds of boost, which the air is just too hot. But that instant power, especially in like an application like if you're drifting and you need that instant down low grunt to break the tires loose, they're great. Now that being said, obviously my car is a drift car. Turbo is a little bit laggy as the exhaust gas is spooling the turbo up, but all said and done, like I don't mind it at all. At the end of the day, like at the same boost level, you're going to make more power with the turbo. It's just this wasted gas versus actually having to use power to make power. But I prefer turbo overall. The feeling, the sound, the overall feel, drivability, it's brilliant. And also too, in a turbo application, I mean, if you're driving around town, I mean, you can stay at a boost. Generally, your gas mileage is a little better as well. If you're on it, the thing turns into a monster. And the engine's under load, the turbo spools up, big smile on your face. So that's ultimately why.
The most common reason people choose superchargers is because of how cost effective it is to increase your horsepower. And the biggest advantage is that there's no lag. The power delivery is almost immediate because the supercharger is driven by the engine's crankshaft. Superchargers also make good power at low RPM in comparison to turbochargers. Superchargers do have their disadvantages though, and one of the biggest ones is that they actually steal energy from the crankshaft to produce more power, whereas turbos are powered by waste energy in the exhaust. This makes them much less efficient.
Alright, so we're here with Martin with his Supercharged S2K. Martin, thanks so much for coming out. Quick question for you. Why did you decide to go for the Supercharger rather than the turbo?
I went with the Supercharger mainly because it has the same feel as NA, and what I mean by that is the throttle response is immediate versus a turbocharger. You got a lot of turbo lag. So I really enjoyed the car when it was NA before I boosted it, and it had like amazing throttle response, and it's very rewarding as a driver, as a time attack driver, to have that feeling and that immediate response and get the feedback from the car. So that was my main selling feature. It's also a little bit cheaper. It comes in a kit, which is very convenient. I know they have a lot of turbo kits, but you still have to piece together a lot of stuff. You could say it's also a little bit more reliable in some aspects. But yeah, it's mainly for the feel. I love the way it feels.
So have you ever driven a turbocharged car?
Yeah, actually, a good comparison would be my tuner's car. He has the exact same car and it's turbocharged, and I love it, don't get me wrong. It definitely puts you in your seat once it hits boost, and the potential to make more power is definitely there, right? You'll always make more power with boost. But again, you do have to get used to the turbo lag. You have to anticipate it on the track. You have to really adapt your driving style. And, they also, are fairly complicated as well. Superchargers, pretty simple actually. So there's not much to really go wrong with it other than break a belt. So a lot of pros in that sense, but I mean, the negatives are definitely, it tends to overheat. And the power and again, because it's a centrifugal supercharger, it builds boost with power. So that 420 horsepower is at 9,000 RPM, and you don't have that 420 down low, but it's a sacrifice that I was willing to make.
It's always good to remember that with all forced induction systems, the engine internals will be exposed to higher pressures and temperatures, which will of course affect the lifespan of the engine. It's best to build the engine from the bottom up to handle these pressures, rather than relying on stock internals. That is it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and click that subscribe button below. And don't forget to follow our Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok page, if that's still a thing. Because Trump.
Fast TV.
Hey,
Yeah.
he already knows what it is.
I know what it is.
Yankish. So high off this rubber.
Your laughter gets every time.
Can't slide. You can't drive. It is what it is.